protests that have been going on in India that have started back in November, and they've been met with massive amounts of violence. Well, first of all, they're like unprecedentedly huge, massive amounts of turnout, also a lot of violence, disappearances, arrests, the blackouts in terms of internet access that the Modi government has rained down on protesters in the regions that are protesting. This week, Rihanna tweeted about it and Greta Thunberg tweeted about it. And Rihanna was like, why aren't we talking about this? And then, of course, like crazy Hindu nationalists in her mentions are like, how dare you? And all she was like, well, let's just talk about this. But I know you've written some about it, and I wanted to ask you, what are the specific laws that farmers are rising up against? What has happened? Why did it set this off?
Yeah, there was three laws that were introduced in the Indian legislature, in the midst of the pandemic. And these three laws essentially just are market reforms, more neoliberal market reforms into the agricultural sector in India. And they do a couple of things. One is just kind of privatize the entire sector to a greater degree, which makes it harder for farmers to subsist. Most of Indian farmers are subsistence farmers. They're not major farm owners. And also one of the significant things that it did was to remove the regulations of what's called minimum support pricing. So what that is basically give farmers a guaranteed income through state subsidies. So basically it was three laws that increasingly make it harder for farmers to earn a livelihood under the guise of reform. But basically that reform is just, larger corporations, bigger companies being able to come in and gain a foothold in the Indian agricultural sector.
So if I could just reflect back to you what I just heard, as someone who doesn't know a lot about this, what I think you just said is that most Indian farmers are subsistence farmers, which the meaning of subsistence farmers is that you only make enough to barely subsist on, and the government decided that was too much.
Basically, yeah.
And that that was too much, and they wanted to be able to pay farmers less than they need to subsist.
Yeah.
Okay. Subsist.
Yeah. Subsist. And to remove any minimal income, so to have nothing.
And just in case folks didn't know, I'm reading, this is from Reuters, about 1.3 billion the agriculture sector employs half of India's population of 1.3 billion. And unrest is among 150 million landowning farmers. This is like millions, tens and tens of millions of farmers. It's not like the US where it's like, oh, we're lifting some of the corn subsidies. And then like the farms that are left, which there are fewer and fewer, they've been consolidated, like they get mad. It's far more massive than that.
I feel like Americans can't even comprehend the scale. Like when people protest in India, people fucking protest in India. And it's like, oh yeah, it was a small protest. There were only 75 million people there. And people are like, that's more people than have ever protested anything all combined in the history of the United States.
Yeah, what about the Women's March?
Yeah, that was like 2 million,
Yeah, and the major day of action and Bharat Bandh, which was shut down India, was 250 million people. So that was the largest single day. But millions of people continue to surround New Delhi, which is the capital of India. So essentially, the entire border of New Delhi has been shut down. So all of the roads and the highways that go into the city have been shut down by farmers who have basically occupied every entry into the capital city.
And was there an organization that people were building on, or was this pretty spontaneous?
It's a bit of both. Like I think any mass resistance movement. So for months and months in the lead up to the organizing, especially in Punjab, Punjab is one of the main states where farmers are a majority of the population. There was over 31 trade unions who were involved in base building and building power in Punjab. But also there was a lot of spontaneous organizing, and we see that ongoing now, right? The kind of caravans that keep coming and the tractors that keep coming into New Delhi really are quite spontaneous, of young people and elders. And a lot of villages have basically mandated that every family will continue to send one person to the protests in Delhi.
Wow.
And this is, because right now the tactic of the government, of course, is to stall and to see how long people will wait it out, especially in the winter months. And so every family has said that they will, on an ongoing basis, continue to send one member of their family.
So like when the village mandates that everyone, every family sends somebody, like, but that doesn't include like during brunch, right?
There would be no brunch without them.
Yes, we don't do brunch.
Nobody goes back to brunch.
Yeah. There's no Sunday brunch on the farm.
Yeah, they took their cues. I wanted to ask you, Harsha, so like what's the broader like the historic importance of farmers to India's economy? And this isn't the first time they've been put in the crosshairs of like transnational capitalism. And I know that in like the late 90s and early 2000s when globalization was really taking hold, that they were also targeted and had to fight back. So can you just sort of situate us like where we're at in this long struggle?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And, that is one of the key differences between the United States and what's happening in India, of course, is that, there hasn't been that kind of capture of capitalism to the same degree. And so 86% of farmers in India are small landholding farmers or farm workers, right? So they're not major capital ventures or major corporations. And this is a long struggle. And, we could go really far back into the British Raj and the period of British Empire. But really, even just going back 30, 40 years, the Industrial Revolution or kind of industrial farming revolution in India was called the Green Revolution, which is like the worst name, right? Because it was the opposite of green. It was completely polluting, full of pesticides, and was bringing in industrial farming into India. And this was like a global template of how to capture small farm owning land holdings. And so the Green Revolution began in the 70s. It was kind of the time of when the World Bank was like, we're going to bring capitalism to the whole world and, to newly freed post-colonial states. And so the Green Revolution was a disaster. It brought in monocropping, brought in evil corporations like Monsanto, polluted the water, and has led to an epidemic of farmer suicides that people often hear about in the news. And even until 2019, over 10,000 farmers in India every single year committed suicide as a result of mounting debt. That's like about 28 people every single day. And this is, a crisis that oftentimes we hear about as like, just one of misery, without really looking at the reasons of why there is such an epidemic, why people are so desperate that they're killing themselves, and really the crisis of debt. And in Punjab, which I mentioned earlier, so Punjab is a state where Punjab actually literally means 5 rivers. That's what Punjab means, 5 rivers. And the state of the 5 rivers is the breadbasket for all of India. It's a state that produces over 60% of Indian staples, like rice and wheat.
Right.
And in the Punjab is the epicenter of farmer suicides, and where farmers are indebted at a rate of about 2% of the rest of the country. So really farming has been, there's, the kind of stronghold of capitalism to try to indebt farmers, to try to, bring in GMOs, to bring in pesticides. All of this is really the long arc of the agricultural crisis in India.
And who's motivating these policy changes, this legislation? Is it a homegrown is it the homegrown ruling class in India, or is the World Bank or multinational corporations involved too?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. And that's what's really ironic about.
Are you saying the world is complicated? I need either or answers.
They're both, right? They're both. And one of the things that's really ironic about Modi, who's a Hindu fascist, is he tries to present himself as this kind of parochial right-wing nationalist, right? But similar to Trump, he's actually one of the world's most business-friendly politicians. And, so there are local companies like Ambani and Adani, who are some of the world's richest people, who are, there really isn't such a thing, I don't think, as like the local elite, right? They're transnational by their very nature. But absolutely, the U.S. has for many decades been aggressively pushing at the World Trade Organization for countries like India to remove their trade protections on agriculture, to remove subsidies. And so it's a mix of these forces of transnational capital, which are arguably never really local.
Wait, are you saying
no more rhetoricals? Wait a minute.
Wait a minute.
Go for it.
We didn't have anything to do with this. America, we don't, whatever. World Trade Organization hasn't been relevant since it won. Hey, thanks so much for watching the Bitchuation Room podcast live stream. And while you're here, why don't you just subscribe to this channel? I promise it'll be good. Promise.